One common claim I hear floating around is that whites benefited from slavery and that whites are as well off as they are because of slavery. Different people have different variations on this claim, some claiming more than others. Obviously, the United States is not made of cotton, tobacco, or indigo today. The argument is not that blacks literally built the infrastructure. If they're making that argument, it's obviously false since most rail was in the North and nearly all rail workers during slavery were white. But the profits off their labor funded the industrial expansion. We have data about the South and the black population of all slave states, including those that did not succeed, and 26 or 30.8% of the Confederacy. Obviously, the Southern economy was a dead end, so the argument hinges on the South funding the Northern economy. I'm not talking about morality or even the conditions of the slave. The topic is whether or not whites, on aggregate, benefited from slavery at the time. And there are two aspects to this. First, the South funding U.S. industrialization argument. The South is the direct exportation of labor, and how much did whites get directly from black slaves versus what they would have gotten doing other things. 1. South funding U.S. industrialization. 1A. Northern agriculture was more valuable than Southern agriculture. In 1960, 85% of all U.S. farm acreage was in the North. Now it's possible that Northern farm production was less than 65% of the value of what was produced, or less than 50% that of the South, with 35% of the farmland produced more money with its agriculture than the North did with their agriculture. But there are some reasons not to believe this. First, the overall value of farm products produced in 1860. So the product, cereals, total value in millions, about 55, 558 million. Cotton, 211. Hay, 152. Potatoes, 44 million. Tobacco, 21 million. The combined product of hay and potatoes gives King Cotton a run for its money. But the real value of U.S. farm production in the 1860s was cereal. I don't know what percentage of farms in the North and South produce cereal, but I do know that if they were more geared towards cereal, wheat, oats, barley, corn, than the South. We also know that farmland in the North cost more per acre, according to Peter Lendert's study of farm prices in the paper Long-Running Trends in American Farmland Values. So in the Mid-Atlantic, farm price per acre 98 dollars. The North Central, East North Central, $92. East South Central Mississippi value, $58. New England, $46. West North Central, $31. The South Atlantic, $29. And West South Central, $26. There are a lot of reasons land would cost more in the North. I'm not saying the additional cost was entirely a function of additional yield, but the fact that it did cost more makes the idea that Southern agriculture was in aggregate more valuable than Northern agriculture seem unlikely, or at least show that there is no obvious reason to believe it would be more valuable. And so, if slavery was such an enormously profitable exploitation, why wasn't land in the slave states more valuable? 1B. The tariff was disproportionately paid by the North. A table from The Rise of New York Port by Robert Greenhang looks at the percentage of imports that were paid by the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And I'm just going to go over the years here. So 1821 to 1830, all three states paid 79.7% of the tariffs. 1831 to 1840, they paid 80% of the tariffs. 1841 to 1850, they paid 80% of the tariffs. And 1851 to 1860, they paid 87% of the tariffs. Now, the fact that 80% plus of all imports are going through these states each year doesn't necessarily mean that they're paying 80% plus of all the tariffs, but it probably does. And in the year 1859, the Port of New York paid roughly 76.67% of all U.S. tariffs. So for that 1 year, the imports roughly matched the tariffs paid, and there is no reason to expect that, barring minor fluctuations year by year, the percentage amount a state pays in tariffs is going to be about the same as the percent of all imports going through that state. Annie Hall looked at the highest tariff revenues of selected ports in the United States in FY 1859 and listed off some of the revenues of various ports. So the New York port revenue is $35.155 million, Boston $5.133 million, Philadelphia $2.262 million, New Orleans $2.120 million, San Francisco $1.352 million, and Baltimore $1.011 million. He also made this visualization. In the case of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, this appears to match what we know about the percent of goods imported through these ports. Now, the keen observer will see that these tariffs paid by ports, this does not necessarily mean the real cost of the tariff was paid by the North, as it is possible these goods arrived in northern ports where the tariff was paid, and the cost was passed on to southern farmers. This is why I pointed out that northern agriculture was bigger than southern agriculture, and according to the National Park Service, the North had twice as much machinery per acreage than the South, which translates to 78.79% of all agricultural machinery. So even if we presume farmers were hit hardest by the tariffs because it increased the cost of farm machinery, a disproportionate amount would be paid by the North anyway because they bought most of that farm machinery. So no, the North was paying slightly more than 80% of the tariffs directly and used slightly less than 80% of all agricultural machinery. The North was paying around 80% of the tariffs in both direct and indirect costs. The South was not paying the tariffs, and slave labor produced 1/3 of what the South was paying based on their population. 1C, a disproportionate amount of federal infrastructure funds went to the South. Not that it matters much since federal spending in 1860 was $78 million, while the GDP of the U.S. was roughly 4,387 million, or 4.387 billion. Federal spending amounted to 1.78% of the GDP in 1860. Wow. For what it's worth, 52% of all federal infrastructure spending went to the South between 18 and 1860. But it was a drop in the bucket, so who cares? Yeah, it's a very small amount. It's less than 2%. The direct benefit of slavery for whites. The South didn't need slaves to grow cotton. And so we can see the South did not build the U.S. And since the argument for a big white benefit from slavery requires the South paying for the development of the United States, this makes the idea that blacks in the South paid for it through their labor basically impossible. The next question is, how much did whites benefit from having black slaves instead of having to negotiate a wage? Well, this is difficult to tell, but we have rough estimates for the return on investments for slaves compared to railroads and short-term 90 days to 180-day loans. This gives us a rough idea of how profitable slaves were compared to the rest of the economy. Profitability by investment, the economics of the American Negro slavery. Table 14, page 208. Table 25, page 220. So we can look at the profit rates here. Boston Rails investments from 1845 to 1860. The average profit on that is 8.6%. Southern Rails, 1850 to 1860, 8.5%. Slaves from 1830 to 1860, 12.61%. Short-term money, loans, 1830 to 1860, 9.6%. All rail loans, 1846 to 1860, 7.1%. And rail bonds, 1857 to 1860, 7.6%. Now let's not sneeze at an average profit of 12.61 would be amazing today. But remember, profits were higher back then than they are today. It's important. I think it's important, by the way, just to break in that I think that Ryan Falk is kind of comparing things at the time. Because one thing I see when people talk about quote unquote injustices of the past is that they're comparing it to the modern economics of like the 90s or like today. So this is a smart move by him. There were probably specific investments that paid better than slaves, but there was probably no class of investment that was more profitable than slavery. Now, if you're a free market autist and wondering why everyone just didn't invest all their money in slaves, well, why aren't you finding the most profitable thing to invest in today and putting all your money in that? Good question. By 12.61% profit means 87.36% cost. It means that roughly 87.39% of what a slave was producing went back into feeding, clothing, sheltering the slave, as well as paying for whatever was needed for him to continue working. Remember, your employer sometimes pays your health care, but they don't pay your gas money, you know. So you become incredibly dependent when you're a slave. But what if the South didn't have slaves? Could they have grown cotton without slaves? The answer is a resounding yes. Cotton production, the growth of the cotton industry in America. These are the average pounds. I'll go through this. 1856 to 1861. Bales produced average just under 4 million. Pounds bale average 454 pounds. Pounds produced annual average 1.733, probably in the, really? No. God, it's much slower. 1865 to 1870, about 2.5 million. 442 for pounds, about just over 1,000 pounds produced annual average. 1870 to 1876, just under 4 million pounds. Pounds bale annual average is 459 pounds, and pounds produced annual average is 1.834. 1861 to 1865 is the Civil War. And we can see the cotton production collapsed after it. Now, it's hard to tell exactly due to annual fluctuations, but it seems like cotton production matched its pre-war peak around 1871 and went up from there. So yes, cotton could be produced without slaves. It shouldn't be too hard to believe since most white Southerners were farmers, and most farmers of the United States at the time were white and produced a net food surplus. Opportunity denied. In 1860, slaves were 12.67% of the U.S. population. Now, while some whites gained that sweet 12.61% profit off their slaves, the average profit for investment in the economy at large was around 8.5%. So we're talking a 4 to 5% higher profit than people who invested in slaves got compared to what they would have gotten if they invested somewhere else. This right here is what some whites got from slavery. I want to break in here again is that not all slave owners in the United States were white. There were black slave owners, there were Jewish slave owners. So when you're talking about the top, 1%, 1.5% of people in the U.S. that owned slaves, they weren't exclusively white. For this rhetorical argument that Ryan Folk is making here, he's just kind of assuming they're all white. They're not. Okay, let's see. Because of these high profits, a certain amount of investment could have been used on railroads, shoe factories, or something good. Instead, were used on more slave plantations. This did two things. It diverted Southern investment into short-term profits of slavery instead of long-term profits of industry. Say you build a shoe factory. That factory has a bunch of machines to work the leather and buckles and stuff that machines needs people who know how to work it, and machines need people who know how to work them. It requires iron, steel, lubricants. Basically, you have a machine tools industry now Now you have to start making them. Machine tools in general become cheaper for other things, creating investment opportunities in textiles or in metal teapots, kettles, coaches, and steam engines. You can see how that expands an economy, right? The cost of producing all those individual things will go down once you've invested in like textiles or machine making. The plantation has no such expansion effects. And this, to oversimplify a bit, is why the North exploded and the South stagnated. I'm not blaming the black slaves for it. They didn't do anything. They couldn't do anything. It is merely to say that whites could certainly have gone more in the industrial direction if they didn't have slaves. I'm not alone in the speculation. It is hypothesized that Rome would have industrialized if it didn't have slaves. You know, you look at how slow that cotton production is. Even when it reaches back to its peak, you know, machine can do that so much faster. So if Rome had developed machinery to like pick cotton or to produce food, you know, it would have changed the course of history. But slavery prevents, in fact, any kind of stagnation in the economy prevents innovation, right? People, libertarians like myself, criticize this all the time with roads being subsidized by the government, right? So you have a whole free market industry, right, of cars that are regulated by the government to drive on government roads, but the like Walmart and the people that make the cars aren't directly funding the roads. The roads are funded on government paying for them, right, on debt. So are roads profitable? Well, probably not. So we probably should find other ways to move goods and services across a vast, you know, field without creating so much debt. But whenever you have an industry kind of trapped in time and it's like this is the way it's always going to be, we're always going to fund this, you prevent innovation from taking place. Just as an example. Because like in Rome, just to finish that point, in Rome, like when people they're like, this is just how it is. This is just how slaves functioned. In the U.S., you had people literally innovating, creating better ways of doing things, more moral ways of producing an economy in the North, and they're competing kind of with this old stagnated way where you keep reinvesting into something that's not going to create, first of all, a moral society, but isn't going to create future jobs, right? You're just going to create and invest in more slaves. Kind of a sinkhole effect. It diverted Southern investments away from things that employed white workers and towards things that employed, quote unquote, employed black slaves. Any white who didn't own slaves, which remember is most like beyond most of them. We're talking about the evil top 1% here. Any whites who didn't own slaves was made poor by the fact that other whites did because investments were diverted from, say, railroads, which he could be employed to slaves. Now, whether the total value of short-term extra profit, again, 4 to 5%, some whites got from slaves instead of other investments outweighs the effect it had on the South. Oh, it had on directing the South down a long-run economic dead end. It began. Uh, um, Sorry, let me start the sentence again. It's a long sentence, Ryan. Now, whether the total dollar value of the short-term extra profit, again, about 4 to 5%, some whites, not all whites, people got from slaves instead of other investments outweighed the effects it had on directing the South down a long-run economic dead end of being an agricultural resource economy in the immediate impact of denying white working class in the South better employment opportunities. I don't know. I don't know either. Intuitively, I think it has absolutely made whites worse off. It certainly made working class whites worse off, and it may have even ultimately been worse for the investing class, who may have ultimately had higher profits in about 20 years if they had invested in factories. Conclusion. But that was a very theoretical argument. Lots of manys and coulds. It would be impossible to know for certain whether whites on net benefited from slavery at the time. However, the big argument about the South through slavery funding the tariffs and thus industrial expansion in the North is absolutely wrong, dead wrong. And really, we're at the point of talking about an additional profit margins of slavery versus the denied opportunity for white workers and long-term economic stagnation effects of slavery. Now, in this post, I have not gone through the cost of the Civil War, and that was brought on by slavery, damaging political externalities of having a large African population in the United States, or the budgetary impact of blacks today. The point of this post was the core of it, the idea that whites gained significantly from black slavery, and whites certainly did not gain significantly. Extra 5% profit for the super rich in the South, that may add up to half of percent of GDP of the whole of the United States, if that. Whether whites in the U.S. on aggregate gained at all is more debatable and more sketchy. I have a strong feeling that we didn't, but I didn't have any of the data to back it up, just economic theory and examples. Certainly, the theoretical cost of slavery sounded like they would dwarf that extra profit, which may add up to 2% of the GDP of the South. But once you start thinking in these terms, you're a million miles away from whites in the U.S. today, most of whom descended from immigrants who came after 1865, owe their wealth and profits extracted, owe their wealth and profits, owe their wealth to the profits extracted from slaves. You're dealing with very small numbers that are going to be dwarfed by the cost of the Civil War and the budgetary impact of blacks. Anyway, and that's something we'll get to in the future, is just how costly blacks existing in the United States are today. But this, once again, I feel like this is all preamble. It's interesting going back and reading these articles because he's really kind of building the foundation for more solid devastation of kind of these altars that liberalism is kind of built on for the future, and especially when we're going to talk about slavery in the future and how, well, he'll get into it later, but you got to remember, we're talking very small numbers of people. We're talking how many people came over the transatlantic slave trade from Africa, where there's a lot of slaves. I think it was 500. It was like 500,000. It was like 500,000 blacks were transported from Africa to the United States. There were, and the estimates of white slaves being taken to the Middle East is between 1 and 2 million. So there were more white slaves in the Middle East by at least double at the lowest estimates. And he'll kind of, I'm not sure if he'll touch on that exactly, but he's gonna touch on a lot of the stuff around slavery, including some information that I've never seen replicated anywhere, and kind of talk about how these narratives about slavery in the U.S. are formed, basically when people believe in Santa Claus. And actually, if I can find some of his original videos on the topic, I'll try to go over those too, because I think the way he presents the information is very impactful. And for being kind of a stilted guy, he actually puts a lot of emotion in his videos. Yeah, that's all. No more ums. I'll try to get out of here. Like and subscribe. I also started a Odyssey and a Rumble. I'm not currently uploading my videos to BitChute, but I'll keep uploading them to YouTube until they get canceled, which probably will be pretty soon. Thank you all. You can follow me on, like I said, you can follow me on Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube while I'm still here. Thank you. Bye.